Welcome back, computer science students. Today we're going to jump into our next video in the kind of advanced topics for classes. We're going to talk about another example in our class where we want to overload a method. So now that we're using, we talked about in the last video, using this new system to generate new IDs for students, where we start with the first student's going to have an ID of 1,000, and then whenever we add a student, we're going to use the static variable to track what the next ID should be, because the static variable is updated every time a new student is created, and it applies to all the objects. And so this is sort of the list of what the next ID should be. Well, there's times when students need to update when we may need to update students' ID numbers. Maybe if we go from a 4-digit to a 5-digit ID system, we need to loop through and update all our students to a new 5-digit ID or something. Which, by the way, is why IDs tend to be long, like 8 digits or 9 digits or something to that effect, because it's a headache to update from 3-digit to 4-digit ID systems or things like that. But for example, we're going to stick with our little ID system. But the important part is we may need to provide a way to update student IDs, but update them so that the user does not provide their new ID number, but instead their new ID number is generated based on our static next ID variable here. So whenever I want to set a student's ID or reset a student's ID, I can do it using our static next ID variable here. So to do that, we're going to need to overload our setID method to take no inputs instead of an ID input. So we're going to add another method, public void setID with no inputs. And the goal of this method is just to set ID or this.id. Either one will work in this case. Remember, the keyword this is only relevant when we have an input that has the same variable name as a field. If these two match, then this.id refers to the field and ID references the input. In our case, we don't have that problem. There is no int ID being passed in here, so there's no duplicate variable name problem. So if we type ID, the computer will know that there's only one ID we could be referring to, and that is the member variable, which is nice. So we can type ID. I'd also like to highlight there isn't technically anything wrong with typing this.id. Inside of this new overloaded method I created, they mean the same thing. ID or this.id do the same thing. So we're going to set ID equal to next ID, and then we're going to increment next ID, right? With a plus. So now we've updated the student's ID number to what the current next ID should be, and then we've set next ID to be ready to be used in the future. And so this is another good use of static and another good use of overloading. So let's we have a really good live example about how we could use this. As written, the student Ryan Matfeld has an ID of 1. Connie Book and John Smith are using the new ID system of 1000 and 1001. So now we need to update Ryan Matfeld's ID to give him a new one that fits the new system. So we're going to do student1 dot set ID, and we're going to use the nothing in parentheses version. So that means that we will use or update my ID with the new ID here, following the new system, and then we can verify that worked by doing student1 dot get ID. Right, make sure that my ID is now 1002 instead of 1. And so let's run this. Yep, and so sure enough, my final print statement here says that student 1's ID is now 1002. So my system is working. Anytime I set an ID or add a student, they get that next ID variable and then they update it so that the next student that's created, or the next student whose ID is updated correctly. So another good usage of static and another good way to overload a method. it is worth, I want to highlight, I guess, just to make sure overloading methods is clear, that I could do student1, I could still do this, student1.setID, and I could provide a new ID number, like 17. And because I provided an integer value as input here, Java will go find the setID method that matches, which is this one, and run this code, and not run the code for my overloaded method. So with overloaded methods, you find the one that matches and you run it. So then if I do a system.out.println with student1.getID, we'll get 17. And then maybe a little quiz question for you, or practice question. If I set ID again and print student1's ID again, then what will it be? So we're going to add, currently we would print out 1, 1000, 1001, 1002. The next printout would be 17, and the next printout would hopefully, if you're following along, be 1003, because every time I set an ID or create a new student, I increment my new ID counter. So this will allow us to set IDs either way. And it, depending on what information we give as input, it will call a different method. All right, so jumping in next video, we will talk about private versus public, and again, keep using the static variable as an example.